Winter had sunk its teeth into Silesia long before anyone stepped inside the exhibition hall that Saturday. Katowice and the neighboring city of Chorzów lay under hard, dirty snow, the kind that had stopped being beautiful weeks ago and turned into frozen weight on every flat roof in the district. Evening was closing in on January 28, 2006, the sky already dark by the time people pushed through the glass doors of the Katowice International Fair Hall for the second day of the National Exposition of Carrier Pigeons. Inside, the winter seemed far away. The cavernous trade hall glowed with sodium and fluorescent light, a football field-sized space divided into rows of cages, banners, and makeshift stands. Families in heavy coats, now unzipped and draped over their arms, wandered the aisles. Breeders from Poland, Germany, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and beyond leaned over wire cages, admiring birds that cost more than some of their cars. Children pointed at mottled wings. Loudspeakers crackled with announcements. The smell of feathers, sawdust, and cheap food mixed in the warm air. Above them, unseen, the snow was changing. For days, storms had rolled through southern Poland, leaving layer upon layer on the flat roof. First powder, then the packed, crusted masses that came with repeated thaws and freezes. The warmth rising from thousands of bodies and the hall's lighting softened the lowest layer just enough for it to creep, settle, and refreeze into dense, heavy slabs, nearly 1.5 feet deep. The roof structure, steel trusses and panels stretching over 300 feet in each direction, had already told its story once before, in 2002, when snow had buckled parts of it and temporary repairs were made over a quiet, anxious winter. The hall felt alive that evening. Around 5 p.m., with less than 2 hours before closing, the crowd was still thick. Hundreds, perhaps close to 700 people moving between stands, bartering over birds and feed and future champions. Near the center of the hall, just under the highest span of the roof, a breeder from Silesia leaned in to negotiate the price of a promising young cock, his breath visible only in his imagination. Outside, the air hovered around 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, his attention was on plumage and bloodlines, not on the faint popping sound that vanished into the background noise of voices and loudspeaker announcements. Minutes before the collapse, there were warnings that didn't sound like warnings. Someone noticed a narrow new crack in a wall panel and mentioned it in passing. Another exhibitor thought the hall lights flickered in a way they hadn't earlier in the day. In one corner, a few people heard what they later described as a long creak, as though a giant door hinge were turning somewhere overhead, followed by a short, sharp snap that made heads tilt up for a second. Then, the background noises swallowed it, and the bartering and laughter resumed. Outside, the snow on the roof had reached a tipping point. Local fire brigade officials would later say that accumulated snow and ice loaded the roof far beyond its intended limits. Subsequent investigations would calculate that some regions carried more than twice the designed snow load. In structural terms, the roof's bracing and member connections were insufficient. In narrative terms, the hall had become a trap, whose failure would not be gradual. At 5:15 p.m. local time, the trap sprang. There was no countdown, no dramatic chain of small collapses. Witnesses later described a single, overwhelming roar as the central section of the roof, corrugated metal, steel members, and tons of snow gave way and dropped onto the crowd below. Lights went out in an instant, plunging the hall into a choking blizzard of darkness, dust, and snow. Metal slammed into concrete. Stalls, cages, and people were crushed in the same movement. Those closest to the edges were thrown off their feet, but some of them could still see faint light filtering through ragged tears in the roof. A woman near the eastern wall felt the floor drop beneath her and found herself suddenly outside, thrown through a gap where the wall had peeled away. Behind her, the hall she'd been standing in had become a crater. She ran toward it anyway, screaming names into the darkness and dust. Others were swallowed completely. Beneath the collapsed span, snow and steel formed a deadly lattice, leaving narrow voids, pockets where a person might be able to breathe for a while if injuries and the cold allowed it. Screams and shouts for help broke out, then muffled as dust and snow filled mouths and lungs. In the wreckage, hundreds of carrier pigeons remained in their cages, birds bred to find home from 100 miles away, now calling frantically in the dark, some already crushed, others trapped and waiting for hands that would never come. Outside, the first calls hit emergency services almost immediately. "The roof has collapsed," callers said. Some thought there had been an explosion. Local firefighters and paramedics from Katowice and Chorzów mobilized within minutes, followed quickly by units from across the region. 103 firefighter teams, more than 1,000 firefighters, mountain rescue specialists, mine rescue crews from nearby Bytom, and over 200 police officers with dogs. The access roads, lined with snowbanks, jammed with flashing lights. The temperature was a second enemy. By the time the first rescuers reached the site, night had fully fallen. Floodlights and vehicle lamps carved cones of harsh white through freezing air. The rescuers climbed onto a surface that was no longer a roof, but a jagged hill of twisted metal sheets and snow, under which people were screaming, moaning, or eerily silent. With temperatures down around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, every minute trapped under that debris meant deeper hypothermia for the injured who had survived the initial crush. It was not a standard rescue. The heaps of snow that had helped crush the hall were now helping hold portions of the remaining roof in precarious equilibrium. Heating the voids with hot air, a typical tactic to keep survivors from freezing, was too risky. Melt the snow, and the remaining roof sections could let go and finish what the first collapse started. Fire officers ordered rescuers to work with hand tools and small equipment, cutting and lifting what they could, inch by inch, always listening for new groans from the structure above. Inside that tangle, survivors clung to consciousness in darkness. One exhibitor found himself wedged in a narrow void under a slab of roof and a drift of snow, the weight pressing his chest so hard he could barely breathe. Somewhere nearby, the steady whimpering of a child gradually faded, then stopped. Search dogs barked above their heads. Metal screeched as rescuers cut a gap large enough for a light at a gloved hand to reach through. 90 minutes after the first collapse, while rescuers were still inside the wreckage, a second section gave way. There was another terrifying lurch and crash as more of the weakened structure failed, injuring at least one firefighter and forcing commanders to pull teams back and rethink their approach. For a moment, the floodlit scene froze, rescuers standing in the snow, watching the hall sag further inward. For commanders on the ground, the calculus was brutal. 3 confirmed survivors still signaling from the wreckage versus the certainty of more deaths if another section fell on rescue teams already exhausted and operating at the edge of what the cold would allow. They went back in. Through 14 hours of darkness, the hall stayed the color of floodlights, exhaust, and blood. Rescuers worked in shifts measured not in hours, but in how long hands could function in the cold before becoming useless. Firefighters and medics moved victims to an adjacent building that had been turned into an impromptu triage center. Ambulances shuttled back and forth to hospitals across the region. The confirmed death toll climbed relentlessly from dozens to 60 as bodies were found under collapsed trusses, in crushed aisles, in pockets where cold and injury had outlasted hope. By Sunday afternoon, the search for survivors ended. Janusz Skulic, the commander of the Silesian Fire Service, told reporters that the probability of finding anyone alive under the roof was now close to 0. Heavy equipment moved in to clear the remaining rubble, pushing aside snow that still carried the imprint of the roof that had ridden it down. In the final count, 65 people were dead and around 180 injured, making it the worst construction disaster in modern Polish history. In the days that followed, the hall's twisted skeleton stood as a dark shape against the snow, a landmark on the edge of Katowice that no one wanted to look at, but everyone recognized. 65 families learned that night that someone who left that morning to look at pigeons would not return. The investigations would take years. The absence would be permanent. Politicians promised inquiries. Engineers and prosecutors began combing through drawings, emails, and inspection reports that would reveal a design weakened to save money and a roof left to bear a winter it was never truly built to carry. But on that freezing January evening, long before anyone traced the load paths or recalculated snow weights, the people in the hall experienced the disaster in a simpler way. A warm, noisy sanctuary turned in an instant into a cold, crushing silence. The immediate aftermath of January 28th gave way to harder questions. 65 people had died under a roof that was supposed to shelter them. In the weeks and months that followed, investigators, engineers, and prosecutors would work to understand not just what had happened, that much was visible in the twisted steel, but why it had happened, and whether anything could prevent it from happening again. The Katowice Fair Hall was a large-span structure, essentially a vast column-free exhibition space covered by a steel-framed roof stretching more than 300 feet in each direction. This kind of design offers tremendous flexibility for trade shows and exhibitions, but it also places enormous demands on the roof structure itself. The roof relied on steel trusses and secondary members designed to carry self-weight plus imposed loads, including snow, in a cold climate region where winter loads are not an afterthought. Polish structural codes specify snow loads based on climatic zones. Design engineers are expected to consider peak ground snow loads, drift and accumulation patterns on large flat roofs, and load combinations with temperature and wind. On paper, the roof should have been able to resist the design snow load with adequate safety margins. But the structure that stood above the Pigeon show in January 2006 was not the structure originally conceived in the codebooks. Investigations would reveal that design modifications had been introduced to reduce costs without proper recalculation of structural capacity. The roof that hundreds of people stood under that Saturday evening was fundamentally weaker than anyone realized, except the people who had made it that way. The official investigation, led by Polish prosecutors and structural engineers, concluded that the collapse stemmed from a combination of design inadequacies, construction shortcuts, and maintenance failures, compounded by an exceptionally heavy snow load that winter. The roof did not fail because a perfect structure met an impossible storm. It failed because a weak structure met a heavy but foreseeable snow load. Winter 2005-2006 was severe across Poland. By late January, repeated storms had left deep accumulations of snow across the region, and the pattern of freezing, thawing, and refreezing turned what might have been light powder into dense, heavy slabs. Investigators estimated that in some areas, the snow load on the roof exceeded twice the design limit, far beyond what the already weakened structure could bear. The warmth rising from hundreds of people inside the hall likely made things worse. It softened the lowest layer of snow just enough to let it settle and compact, increasing the load even further. The roof, already strained, reached a tipping point. This combination explains the sudden, catastrophic nature of the collapse. The truss system had low redundancy. If one critical member or connection failed, large areas of the roof lost support. Snow loading was non-uniform, with drifts and densified patches creating major local overloads rather than a smooth, even blanket. Once a key region buckled, load shifted rapidly to already overstressed adjacent members, propagating failure across the span. The result was not a slow sagging that gave people time to evacuate, but an abrupt global failure of a large roof area. The structural system had no safety net, and when it failed completely. After review of the failure, Government Commission and expert reports identified three critical technical failures. 1. Inadequate structural design. Incorrect or insufficient cross-sections and detailing in parts of the steel truss system, with inadequate bracing and poor layout of structural members that left the roof vulnerable to uneven loading. 2. Cost-driven modifications. design changes introduced to reduce construction costs without proper recalculation of structural capacity. Experts would later determine that the main reason for the catastrophe was incorrect design that had been altered to make the hall cheaper to build. 3. Massive overload. At the time of collapse, there was over 18 inches of compacted snow and ice on the roof. Analysis suggested that some regions were loaded to more than double the intended design snow load, over 100% beyond capacity. One of the most damning aspects of the Katowice case is that the building had already warned its owners and designers not once, but twice before the disaster. According to the investigation, the roof had buckled under snow as early as 2000 and again under heavy snow in 2002. Emergency or temporary repairs were carried out both times, but the damage was not properly reported to the local building inspector as required by Polish law. Crucially, no full recalculation or reassessment of the structure's capacity was done after these incidents, despite clear evidence that the roof was marginal under winter loads. The 2002 incident should have been a red line. The roof deformed. Temporary repairs were made over a quiet, anxious winter, but the fair reopened, events continued, and the underlying weakness remained. 4 years later, some of the same people who made that decision to patch rather than redesign were standing outside in the snow, watching bodies being pulled from the wreckage. Emails and expert testimony later showed that management and designers were aware of structural problems and snow load vulnerabilities. Expert recommendations called for both snow removal and verification of the design, but these recommendations were not fully implemented. This history reframes the collapse. It was not a bolt from the blue. It was the third major snow load stress event on a roof that had already signaled its weakness twice. The first 2 times were warnings. The third time was a mass casualty event. Heavy snow alone does not doom a building. Operations and maintenance sit between weather and collapse. In the days leading up to the disaster, snow and ice were not properly removed from the roof despite forecasts and visible accumulation. Managers had legal obligations to ensure snow removal and to suspend use of the building if loads became unsafe. In practice, snow remained on the roof during a major exhibition with hundreds of visitors inside. Managers initially claimed that snow removal had been carried out and that financial issues, such as tax authorities seizing accounts, made it difficult to pay for full clearing. Tax officials publicly contradicted this, noting that the company retained enough funds to pay for essential safety measures. Emails recovered from company computers told the real story. Directors were aware of problems and expert recommendations about snow removal and structural verification, but allowed events to proceed regardless. Investigators concluded that cost pressures and poor safety culture led to unacceptable risk tolerance. The show went ahead even as snow accumulated on a known weak roof. The Pigeon exhibition was not a matter of life and death, until it was. The investigation took years. Prosecutors examined design documents, construction records, inspection reports, and maintenance logs. They interviewed engineers, contractors, and officials who had approved the building. What emerged was a picture of systemic failure, a design pushed beyond safe limits to save money, warning signs ignored or inadequately addressed, and a maintenance regime that didn't account for the roof's known vulnerabilities. Several individuals were eventually charged, including designers and officials responsible for oversight, though legal proceedings stretched on for years. The broader question, how a modern structure in a developed European country could fail so catastrophically, led to intense scrutiny of Polish building codes and inspection practices. Years later, Polish courts convicted several individuals in connection with the collapse. While sentences and appeals varied, the overall message was clear. In Poland, under current law, design shortcuts and operational negligence that lead to mass casualties can bring criminal liability, not just civil suits.
The legal system established that documented warnings create responsibility. "I didn't know" is not a defense when the warnings existed, when experts gave recommendations, when the building itself had already failed twice. The Katowice collapse became a turning point for structural safety in Poland, particularly for large-span public buildings. In the years following the disaster, Polish building codes were revised to impose stricter requirements for snow load calculations, especially in regions prone to heavy winter weather. The collapse also prompted closer attention to the design and inspection of existing structures, particularly exhibition halls, sports arenas, and other large-span buildings that carry similar risks. Across Europe, the disaster reinforced the importance of robust structural redundancy, designing buildings so that if one element fails, the load can redistribute without triggering total collapse. It also highlighted the dangers of value engineering, the practice of reducing costs by cutting materials or simplifying designs. Done carefully, value engineering can make projects more efficient. Done recklessly, it turns buildings into traps. The collapse also changed how engineers and building officials think about snow loads in a warming, more volatile climate. Southern Poland doesn't get the same snowfall as the Alps or Scandinavia, but it gets enough, and the freeze-thaw cycles can make that snow far heavier than traditional calculations assumed. The disaster underscored that design codes based on historical weather data might not account for increasingly unpredictable winters. The Katowice Fair Hall collapse stands as a reminder that structural safety is not just about calculations on paper. It's about how those calculations are implemented, inspected, and maintained over time. A building is only as strong as its weakest connection, its most overburdened member, its most neglected inspection. Katowice now becomes a case study in structural engineering, forensic engineering, and construction law. The technical lessons are clear. Snow is a dynamic, dangerous load. Snow depths are not the whole story. Density, drifting, partial melting, and refreezing can turn moderate depths to extreme loads on specific roof regions. Large-span roofs in cold climates must have generous safety margins and redundancy. Deformation is a red line. Any buckling, sagging, or cracking under snow load is a serious warning that must trigger full engineering review and possibly closure, not just temporary patching. Temporary repairs are not solutions, they are delays. Maintenance is part of the design. A safe building is not only calculations in steel, it is also procedures for snow removal, inspection after extreme weather, and clear authority to close the building when needed. Documentation and reporting obligations matter. Failing to report earlier roof damage and repairs to building inspectors removed a key layer of oversight. The system relied on transparency that never happened.
After Katowice, the structural engineering literature uses the disaster as a reference point when discussing snow load combinations, leading to more conservative approaches for large flat roofs in heavy snow regions and closer scrutiny of cost-driven design changes. Polish regulations already required reporting significant damage and obtaining inspector clearance after repairs. The case highlighted how critical enforcement and compliance are. Building owners and facility managers in Poland and similar climates increasingly formalized snow removal procedures, trigger conditions, responsibilities, and documentation, knowing that failure can lead to criminal charges. For the public, the collapse was a stark illustration that buildings we trust to protect us are not infallible. They depend on competent design, honest construction, rigorous inspection, and ongoing maintenance. When any of those fail, the consequences can be measured in lives. Could a Katowice-style collapse happen again? The honest answer is uncomfortable. Yes, because the same pressures exist everywhere. Cost still trumps caution in boardrooms. Engineers still face pressure to value engineer structures down to the edge of code minimums. Snow still accumulates where we don't expect it. But what's different now is the weight of knowledge and the weight of consequences. Engineers designing large-span roofs in cold climates now carry Katowice in their reference libraries and their imaginations. When a cost reduction proposal crosses their desk, some remember that 3 architects faced criminal charges for design changes that saved money and killed people. When building managers see snow accumulating on a flat roof, some remember that corporate directors went to prison for deciding the show could go on. The physics hasn't changed, but the calculation has. Before Katowice, ignoring structural warnings or deferring snow removal might have seemed like acceptable risk-taking, a business decision with unclear consequences. After Katowice, it's a decision made with the knowledge that 65 people can die, that criminal prosecution is possible, and that "we didn't know" is not a defense when the warnings were documented. On January 28, 2006, 65 people went to an exhibition hall on a Saturday evening to look at birds, to spend time with family, to talk with friends and fellow breeders from across Europe. They trusted the roof over their heads. That trust was betrayed, not by the snow, not by the winter, but by human decisions made years earlier in offices and construction sites far from the hall itself. The families of those 65 people carry that loss still. The survivors, those pulled from the wreckage, those who ran from the collapsing hall, those who spent that freezing night searching, carry the memory of what they saw and heard. And the lessons learned in the aftermath, the code changes and the stricter inspections, and the renewed commitment to structural safety are the only tribute we can offer. A promise that their deaths were not meaningless, that we learned, and that we will not forget. The Katowice Fair Hall is gone now, replaced by other structures, but the lessons it taught about vigilance, about integrity, about the weight of responsibility that comes with designing and maintaining the buildings we inhabit remain as permanent as the absence it left behind.